Welcome to Stay in Your Lane, the Bible study. We're looking at the theological underpinnings of my book, Stay in Your Lane. So we've drawn three columns. We begin to place the proper question at the top of each column. What's mine? What's theirs? What's God's? And then we try to focus in on I control what's mine. I influence what's theirs. And in this session, we're going to look at what does it mean to accept what's God's? How does that actually work in our life? And so we're going to take a pretty famous and familiar passage, Isaiah chapter 55. And so this beautiful invitation, it says in verse number 1, "Come all you who are thirsty, come to the waters." And it's just this invitation now to life, to seek after God. He says in verse 3, "Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you." A beautiful picture. Now notice what he says in verses 6 through 9. And we actually have the division of the three columns right here in this passage. He says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found." So what do you control? Whether or not you seek him. "Call to him while he is near. Let the wicked," that's theirs, "let the wicked forsake their ways and the unrighteousness their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will freely pardon." But that's between them and God. But notice what he says. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And in this passage, we're reminded of something that all of Scripture has now shown us, what Genesis 1 began with, what Revelation 21 is going to finally prove, and it's this basic idea, you and I ain't God. There's a difference. And yet, if we're not very careful, we would never say it this way. We never think that we're playing this role. But the truth of the matter is that one of the greatest temptations that you and I have is to confuse the person of God with ourselves. And we begin to assume that either we are God or that God thinks and acts just like us. And what happens in that moment is we elevate ourselves higher than what we should be, and we devalue God much lower than he should be. And anytime I'm fixating on myself more than I should, and I'm denying the majesty of God, we suffer negative consequences because of that. And yet, if we can take some simple steps to reorient ourselves back to where we actually are, not nothing, because God has placed his image within us, and yet not God, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And if we will elevate God to the majesty of who he is, this God who has now sovereign control over all things, a mind much richer and greater than any you and I could ever even begin to imagine, to understand that he has ways that in this feeble mind, there's no way I can comprehend what's going on, and then to have a trust that his way must be better than my way because he's a loving, compassionate Father, then we will have life. And yet what happens so often is, even if I understand the distinction between me and God, I tend to think, my way's better. Why won't you do it my way? And so even as Jesus teaches us to pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, the truth of the matter is, what I so often pray is, God, I want my will done in heaven like I'm trying to do it on earth. And Jesus reminds us, and the prophet here, Isaiah, reminds us that's not the way. That there is this way that's outside of yourself. I say it in one of the most deep sentences I've ever written in my entire life. I wrote in Stay in Your Lane, page 120, and it simply says this: some stuff is God's stuff. There's a lot of truth in that. I recognize the simplicity, but some stuff is God's stuff. There are some things that fall outside of my purview, that I don't get to decide what is actually going to happen or take place. And so what I have to do then in that moment is accept it. Now, what does acceptance look like? And let's draw the distinction. I talk about it in the book, Stay in Your Lane. Let's draw the distinction, the difference between to accept something versus what it means to agree with something. So I tell the story in the book about this idea of improv. that if you're going to improvise a scenario, you and another person, that the number one rule of that, as you're making up a scene to make it funny or exciting for other people, the number one rule is this rule of acceptance, which means if you introduce something into the scene, I can't go, hang on, you can't do that. The moment I refuse to build on what you have introduced into the scene, the scene just shuts down in that moment. I have to accept it. And as I accept it, I have to build on it. So let's say hypothetically that you and I are improvising a scene in front of a group of people. We're trying to be funny in that moment, and you pull a gun. I can't go, hang on, we can't do that. If I do, the scene shuts down. The fourth wall is now broken, and everybody knows what we're doing. But instead, I have to accept you've introduced that. Now, I can interpret it however I want to. I can say, hey, why are you holding your thumb and your pointer finger up? I can say, hey, why do you have a water gun? Why do you have a gun without a bullet? Why do you have a fake gun? I can interpret it however I want to. But for the action to continue, for the scene to continue, it's mandatory in that moment that I have to accept what you have introduced and then build on it. Now notice, I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to like it. After the scene is over, I can go to you and go, why did you do that? So help me, if you ever do that to me again while we're on stage, I'm never going to act with you again. I don't have to agree with it. I have to accept it. And so it is with God. There are times in which he introduces things into our lives. We don't have to agree with it. As a matter of fact, all the Psalms now show us that we have every right to shout out to God, to call out to God, to say, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What's going on here in this moment? We don't have to agree, but we do have to accept. And what does it mean to accept? I think acceptance is this basic concept of, it means we're going to buy into reality. To say, okay, here's what's going on in my life. I don't like it, but it's here. God's ways are not my ways. His thoughts are higher than my thoughts. And so I'm going to lean in. I'm going to trust now God's sovereign design for my life. I'm going to take it. I'm going to build on this. This is the hand that's been dealt to me. Think about some of the things that we have to accept. A diagnosis, a disease, what certain talents you have, personality that's you've inherited, the temperament of your kids. Those are all things that are beyond our control. We can think on a cosmic scale of a global economy, of weather patterns that are taking place. There are these things that are well beyond our scope, and we can pray about them. We can try to influence them. That's the beauty here, is we get to influence them through prayer. But ultimately, what's going to be demanded of us is that we accept that this is reality, and I'm not going to live out of that. But you know what tends to happen if we're not very careful? We tend to, instead of accepting, we tend to live in denial or despair. Denial now rejects the reality. It says, I'm going to pretend like this doesn't exist. And so literally, I've sadly done the funerals of people and walked alongside a widow or widower through the death of their spouse. And 10 years later can come across that person, and they can still be stuck in the exact same situation. Why? Because they never accepted the fact that their spouse had died. While I could bury somebody else and their widow go through the exact same amount of grief, and they find a way to process through it, and 10 years later, it doesn't mean they don't miss the person. They do, but they're not in the same spot. Why? Because they accepted what has taken place. We can live in denial of reality, and literally what we're doing in that moment is just butting against reality, trying to pretend like it doesn't exist. And sometimes whenever we get stuck, the reason that we're stuck in life is because we're living in denial. We haven't accepted. But then we can also live in despair. Just this basic concept of I'm overwhelmed by this reality of what is taking place. I don't like it whatsoever. And so I just throw my hands up like there's nothing that I can do. And instead of accepting it and building on it, we just give up. And the moment we do that, all the action stops. And we get stuck then in that moment of life. And yet the moment we begin to say, you know what, I don't own all things. They don't all belong to me. And we begin to trust God and to accept the things in life that we don't control, and to say, you know what, some stuff is God's stuff. His ways are higher than my ways. His ways are better than my ways. Then we can begin to find, what do we control? So I may not control the diagnosis or the disease. I may not control what's actually going on there, but I do control my reaction to it. Now, I may not fully understand my own personality, but I can figure out a way to use it properly. I clearly don't control the economy of what's going on, but I can find an action in this moment of how to respond to the situations and the circumstances that are around me. The moment we begin to accept the things that are God's, then in that moment we can begin to fixate on the very thing that we're controlling within our own lives and say, all right, now, in response to that, what is it that is actually mine? Now let's get to work on that. How can I build upon what God has actually chosen within my own life? And the moment we begin to accept what's God's, our life picks up a pace. There's an action, there's an activity. If you're bored in life, my guess is in part it's because you're living in either denial or despair of the reality of God. And yet, if you believe that there is a sovereign, powerful God who is carrying out a plan upon this world, and He has called you with a purpose to be a part of that plan, He has gifted you, He has placed you in a geography, challenged you to love people, and then commanded you to live out His commands wherever you are, life will never be boring. There will always be action. There will always be challenges. And yet, if we live in denial or despair of those things, we will get stuck. If you and I will accept what is God's, we will worry less, love more, and get things done.